Let me welcome to the desk now the former UK Prime Minister Liz Truss. Great to see you, Liz. Thanks
Great to be here, Chris.
Got to talk to you about the Israel situation. I've got to say, world leaders, our own Prime Minister, Joe Biden, I think many have been weak, but the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer surely has been quite pathetic in his support for Israel.
Well, he's been hopeless, absolutely hopeless. What has happened in Britain is there's been a partial arms embargo put on Israel just when they need the weaponry to deal with these appalling terrorist attacks. And it's the same issue as here in Australia. They are seeking to appease people on the left of politics, Islamists, instead of doing what is right. And it's not just right for Israel, it's right for the whole of Western civilization. Because if we allow Israel to fall, that is completely disastrous for the future of the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia. So a hell of a lot is at stake here, and we are completely letting Israel down. And Joe Biden has been absolutely appalling in the appeasement of Iran. The only reason these terrorists have the wherewithal to carry out the appalling attacks on October the 7th was because he took the sanctions off Iran in return for absolutely nothing. He's allowed Iran to almost get to the point of getting nuclear weapons, and yet he's telling Israel what to do. He's saying, you can't do this, you can do this, you can't do this, instead of dealing with the aggressor, which is Iran.
It's so extraordinary. For the whole of the past year, the pressure should have been on Iran, but instead it's been on Israel. Just to highlight your point, I want to show you a little clip of what Keir Starmer said just last week.
We need to see an immediate ceasefire to provide space for a diplomatic settlement. And we are working with all partners to that end, because further escalation serves no one.
Yeah, there he was. And now look, Joe Biden, the UN, other countries, European nations and Anthony Albanese were calling for that same ceasefire. If that ceasefire had been adopted last week, Hassan Nasrallah would still be alive and leading a terrorist war against Israel, not to mention countless Hezbollah rocket installations would still be in place in southern Lebanon.
That is absolutely right, and it's Israel that is showing leadership. They're actually dealing with the terror threat, and they're being held back by their so-called allies in the West. And the problem is, we have leftist governments, now in the UK, in the US, in Australia, also in Canada, and they are determined to try and strike some kind of moral equivalence. How can you strike moral equivalence between an appalling autocratic regime which is sponsoring terrorists, and a free democracy? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
What could the international community do to increase the pressure on Iran to effectively call off its terrorist proxies?
Well, first of all, we should put the sanctions back on.
Yep.
I mean, it's absolutely appalling those were taken off. We should give Israel full freedom of manoeuvre. We should supply them with all the weaponry they need to take on the terrorists. Those are the first things we should be doing. But if Iran is successful in securing nuclear weapons, that is an absolute strategic disaster. And the reason we're here is because of the appeasement policy, particularly pursued by the Biden administration. Yes, the UK haven't been good enough. Yes, Australia has not been good enough. But it's ultimately the Biden administration that hold the key, and they have been an absolute disaster. And heaven help us if President Trump does not win in November. Heaven help us.
We await Israel's response against Iran. When you talk about their progress towards nuclear weapons, this would be a likely target, wouldn't it? Israel might be able to try and strike facilities that are important in Iran's nuclear capability.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And it's vital that Iran is stopped from getting nuclear weapons. And that was the point of those extra tough sanctions, was to stop that happening. And now They are very, very close.
Well, it's great to have you in Australia. I've got a couple of other questions I've got to run by you first. You're here for a CPAC conference, a Conservative conference, almost in the American style of Conservative conference here in Australia. When I look at they're kind of a new innovation in Australia, as I say, sort of copying an American model. Does this give us a hint that perhaps the Conservative parties in the UK and in Australia aren't doing enough of this sort of thing themselves, having good policy forums and conferences?
Well, let's be honest, we haven't been winning the argument. I've just been talking about how we've got left-wing governments across most of the West. And if you look at everything from climate change extremism to the human rights culture to the huge levels of migration that are taking place, we have a massive problem in Britain with small boats across the Channel. If you look at the wokery and the shame that people on the left try and inculcate about our country, our history, our culture, if you look at all those things, the establishment has been moving to the left.
Yep.
You know, whether that is media organisations, corporations, the bureaucracy.
Universities,
and we need
the works.
Universities, well, they were the start. That's where it all started. But, you know, we need to be much more forceful in pushing back. And too many so-called Conservatives have got along with this stuff.
Well, that'll all be happening.
In order to stay in power or to, appease their friends at trendy dinner parties. Yep. They've gone along with this stuff. And what is important about CPAC is this is the fight back. And we need this fight back because we need to get Conservative governments back in power. Well,
that'll all be happening over the weekend in Brisbane, so we're looking forward to that. While I've got you here, I've got to ask about your slice of history. Of course, you were a short-term Prime Minister, the shortest serving Prime Minister the UK's ever seen. But what a fascinating and traumatic slice of history for you to be sworn in as Prime Minister and 2 days later Queen Elizabeth II dies. Can you just share with Australian viewers the huge weight of history that must have been on your shoulders at that time?
I mean, it was astonishing in the first place for me to have been in a position to run to be Prime Minister. None of us expected Boris Johnson to be essentially forced out of office, and he was forced out of office by Conservative MPs. None of us were expecting that. And I knew it was a bad sign when I was invited to Balmoral to be asked to be Prime Minister by Her Majesty rather than Buckingham Palace because she was too frail to travel. And when I got there, you know, she was on very fine form in terms of, you know, she was very lucid. She was giving me some great advice. She said, pace yourself, was one of the pieces of advice she gave me. But I could just see that physically she was, you know, struggling to stand up. You know, it was a real effort and she just wanted to do her duty. And at the end of our meeting, she said, I'll see you again next week, as if it was just a routine meeting. So imagine my increasing horror as over the next 24 hours, it was clear things were getting worse. And it was, you know, it was a huge honour to be the last Prime Minister appointed by Her Majesty. Of course, the first was Winston Churchill, but it was such a shock. You know, 2 days into the job.
Incredible.
To take that on.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for joining us, Liz Truss. I really appreciate it.